for those of you that may or may not know NIST, we are an agency within the Department of Commerce in the US. And the reason that they put NIST in the Department of Commerce is they felt that really a lot of the functions that we perform are really underlying foundational functions of bringing prosperity to the US and ensuring that there is economic health. So within the Department of Commerce, I work in IT laboratories where we support that overarching mission, but in the space of IT. And in that capacity, we also support some other things that I just kind of want to share as background. FSMA is an act that was passed by Congress. It actually assigns to NIST the role of not only working across US industry to assure economic prosperity and through cybersecurity and a secure internet, but it also talks about giving specific guidance to federal agencies that they must follow with respect to securing their IT systems. So when we are looking at working closely with private industry, we are also looking at putting out mandatory guidance for federal agencies on how to secure their IT systems, and under that also falls IoT systems. And then one other thing I wanted to point out, we are not regulators. And this usually makes it very easy for us to work across private industry and academia. We have a very special relationship, we feel, with both the internal regulators, because we do have in our code, we are supposed to work across regulators towards reducing overlap and conflicts with regulation and standards. But we also work across private industry, and because they know we do not really have a direct role, but we do work closely with the regulators. We do work very cooperatively with private industry. And this is just to give you an idea of the IoT cybersecurity program. I'm just going to talk about one or two things that we do in the program, but if you're familiar with NIST, we also are a research agency. So we do some very early research into looking at things like lightweight crypto and understanding low-power WAN and some of the security implications of that for IoT, all the way into the applied space, as well as I was talking about, mandatory guidance for federal agencies and voluntary guidance for private industry. This is just some of the areas we've been working in. And I like to talk about this because we stood up the IoT cybersecurity program 2 years ago. But NIST, we have over 200 researchers looking at different aspects of cybersecurity. And we recognized we were doing IoT cybersecurity far before anybody really started talking about it. And we all looked at the word IoT and we said, well, isn't that just a buzzword for what we're really doing already? You know, people talk now about software transparency. We were working on software ID tags well before the idea and the concept of software transparency kind of became mainstream. So we looked around and we looked at all this work that we're doing, and we've been getting a lot of requests. There's some legislation that Bo talked about that actually points to NIST and their role related to IoT. And we said, okay, we really need to pull this all under an umbrella program. We need it all to kind of be coordinated. We want to have a common message. We want to make sure there's a strategy in our work and that it's all informing each other. So that's when I was handed this hat about 2 years ago. And as you can see, there's a pretty wide variety in the portfolio that I try to coordinate across. As I mentioned, we work in the vehicle-to-vehicle transportation space and supporting cybersecurity concerns there. We work in lightweight crypto and full-on crypto, which is work you guys might be familiar with if you're in the security space, all the way through the applied cybersecurity space. We also have the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. We had a wireless infusion pump project there that had been wrapped up about 18 months ago. We started it about 3 years ago. What we do in the NCCOE is we partner with solution providers. We partner with a community of interest. And of course, we bring ourselves to the table. We have a large facility in Rockville, Maryland, and we partnered with about 95% of the wireless infusion pump community. Community of interest around hospitals and healthcare providers came to us and they said, hey, we heard that there might be some security concerns around these wireless infusion pumps. Help us understand what the risks are and help us understand how to actually address those risks. And so then what we do is we put out a Federal Register notice. Vendors come to NIST. We kind of look at who provides a solution in this space. We build out a couple of reference implementations. And then we publish guides intended for private industry where it's a 200 page probably document that talks about, hey, here's the compelling case for your CEO and why you actually want to take the effort to actually build this out. What does it mean for you? All the way down to, here's your BOM. Here's your bill of materials. Here's the software products you need to buy. And then here's how you actually configure it all. So we have a couple of projects. There's some listed here. This is all on our public website. We're kicking off one now around consumer products, where we're going to partner with a couple of consumer product manufacturers, bring them into the lab, bring in a couple of consumer product potential solution providers for some of the cybersecurity issues, and see what we can build out there, working across a community of interest to try and find something cost-effective that can actually be adopted and actually publish something that people can pick up and use. So as part of when I got this hat 2 years ago, the first thing I did was start talking to stakeholders. Everybody's always worried about this line. Hi, I'm here from the government. What can I do to help? But we do actually say that a lot at NIST. So I did spend a while both traveling internationally and engaging with international partners. I work across many of my peers, as well as within the US, to try and understand what can we do to help. What is the real problem around IoT? Is there something really different here? Why do our solutions that we have not work already? And what we decided to do is to guide our work. We came up with these 5 principles for IoT. Anything we do, any solution we provide, any guidance that we might put out, it needs to be risk-based. IoT applications are so varied, and there's such a wide variety of risk. There's probably not going to be a solution that can address everything. It needs to be a risk-based understanding. We kind of embrace the idea of the cybersecurity framework and how it's very outcome-based. Again, looking across IoT, there's so many capabilities of devices. We felt that if we were to express anything, it had to be at the outcome level. And then we would really leave it to the standards development organizations. We would leave it to the industry organizations to kind of understand for their community, what does that outcome mean? So we like to talk very much in terms of being outcome-based and kind of leave the details in the verticals. No one size will fit all. It's an ecosystem of things. It was one of the loudest messages we received very early on. Please, please, please. Everybody was just talking about the device. There was lots of legislation talking about the device. The device needs security. And a lot of our stakeholders came back and said, no, you really need to talk in terms of an ecosystem. It's not really just about the device. You can't expect the device to actually support all the security. For cybersecurity professionals, it's very much, this is about defense in depth. This is not just about the device. You need to leverage everything you have in the ecosystem. And of course, we were told, whatever you do, engage with stakeholders. Please don't go off in NIST and publish something in a dark room and not engage with us. So the first thing we started working on as far as guidance goes is NIST IR 8228. It's a draft that was released for publication, and we had a number of comments that were received. I think our comment period closed about 3 weeks ago. So when we first decided to work on 8228, there were a couple of points we received from stakeholders which guided this initial work, which was published. It addresses both security and privacy. We were told by stakeholders, you really can't talk about one without talking about the other. So they strongly encouraged us to address both security and privacy. So NIST IR, which is an interagency report, that's what NIST uses to publish. It talks about both how do you manage your security risks as well as your privacy risks. The other thing I like to highlight about 8228, we're not trying to boil the ocean here. We're not trying to revisit a lot of existing cybersecurity guidance that's already out there. We do not try to tell everybody how you secure your mobile device, which some may argue is or is not a connected thing to the internet. But what we really try to do is identify those things that fall outside of the kind of the IT realm and highlight for organizations. This is what's different about IoT and what you should be thinking about when you're thinking about IoT risks and how you manage those. The other thing we decided to do is because under FISMA, we are obligated to provide federal agencies with guidance, we wrote this in terms of this is what a federal agency should be doing related to managing the risks associated with IoT. But it wasn't meant for just federal agencies. We like to talk about this a lot at NIST. We find that we get the best product when we collaborate with private industry, and we also find we get the best adoption from federal agencies when they actually see that there's something that we've provided that has been voluntarily adopted by private industry. So although if you do pick this up, you'll see it talks about federal agencies, it's really intended for every organization. It also does not talk about the manufacturer's approach. That was some other takeaways we got. Hey, if we're looking immediately at what is the first need that we need to satisfy here, we can put out requirements for devices. Given supply chain and given how quickly the market moves, there's going to be so much brownfield. Some of these IoT devices have life cycles of 3-5 years. Organizations are going to have to deal with legacy devices that don't support good security. And it's going to take time for the market to move. Even if we say if somebody has a magic wand and says, as of today, these are the requirements for all IoT devices. So this really is looking at an organizational perspective. What do I do understanding I have these devices that have varying capabilities? What do I need to think about in order to secure those? And of course, this is not our last publication. And before I leave the stage, I'll probably talk about this upcoming publication. We like to tell everybody we're not answering everything in this document. That wasn't the intent. We never figured in one document we'd be able to address all of IoT because it is so broad. So it is just meant to be an introduction. So these are just the kind of the concepts we tried to build the document around. I'm not going to talk too much about it. We introduced the concept of risk considerations. We kind of boiled down to 3 high-level things. These are the 3 things we want an organization to think about as they're using IoT devices, because we think these 3 considerations both introduce different risk, but it also may affect the way you actually manage those risks because of the physical presence and the physical impact that an IoT device may have. That doesn't only bring risk, that may actually affect how you decide to push a software patch to that device because that device does potentially interact directly with the physical world. We also talk about risk mitigation goals and areas. We identified 3 kind of high-level areas that organizations may think about when they want to organize their thinking around how do I mitigate IoT risks. One is protect the device. Here's my goals for how I protect the device. Here's my goals for how I protect the data. And what we like talking about is here are my goals for protecting privacy. And we decided there are many aspects of privacy that don't fall into your what we call the CIA, confidentiality, integrity, and availability of data. Those are great tools in some cases for meeting some of your privacy objectives, but there are many privacy objectives that cannot be met through cybersecurity approaches. So we decided to kind of break up the goals in those 3 areas. And we just highlight for people, here's where we think a lot of people have expectations, and they expect that an IoT device can do this, or an IoT device can do that, or an IoT device can support these things because traditional IT does it. And we think that people need to understand those expectations aren't necessarily supported by IoT. And then lastly, we like to point out all the challenges with actually securing IoT as well as protecting privacy. In the appendix of 8228, this was intended for organizations. So we didn't really address most of it to the manufacturer. Hey, I'm building a device. What do I need to do to actually make this a more secure device? But what we did think would be helpful is in the appendix, rather than providing direction for manufacturers, we did want to give organizations some tool set to say, hey, if I'm procuring new IoT devices going forward, what are the things I could be looking at and asking the vendor about and putting into my procurement process as I think about procuring IoT devices. So by no means do we ever intend for these to be requirements, but what we felt like doing was at least highlighting for organizations, here's the 15 here are the 15 considerations for IoT devices that you might want to think about. Within your organization, you probably have filters, depending on the goals you might have, depending on the risk, your risk appetite. You may take these 15 and you may tailor this list to 3. You may take this 15 and you may embrace all of them. So we really introduced a very kind of flexible list of things we wanted organizations to look at. We didn't come up with these by ourselves. Again, we felt there was lots of existing work. We don't like to duplicate work where we don't have to. So what we did is we did look both internationally as well as domestically in the US. And we looked at what is the work already out there. And where do we kind of see common themes and consensus around the things that an IoT device should do around security and privacy? We looked at the UK DCMS work. We looked at Anissa's work, who's working in the EU. We looked at internally within the US. CTIA had a program. The IIC had some guidance that they had put out. So we looked across all of these, and this was how we kind of came up with our initial 15. So we received quite a bit of feedback. A lot of feedback came in sets, and a lot of those sets came from a lot of industry groups that had a lot of industry input into coming up with that feedback. Generally, there was a lot of overwhelming positive feedback. One of the takeaways is we got a lot of requests to take that appendix out and turn that appendix into its own document and really work to elaborate on those 15 a little bit more and what a potential baseline could look like out of those 15 items that we actually highlighted in the appendix. So that's going to be some upcoming work that we're doing. And people like to reiterate, yes, please promote an ecosystem approach to anything you do. One thing that we did here as well is right now in the US, NIST is working on a privacy framework. This was some work that they were asked to work on by the National Economic Council. As a result of that, there was a lot of feedback saying, hey, it's great. And at the point in time that you started on this work, you worked on security and privacy. We think you need to let that other work around a privacy framework evolve, and that will better inform any baseline work that you might be doing around privacy for devices. So for right now, we decided we are going to focus on a baseline, but we are kind of going to be deferring the privacy work until the privacy framework is completely, well, at least far down enough that it can actually inform our work. We had a lot of varied discussions about whether NIST needed to develop an IoT definition or a definition for IoT. I think most of it was overwhelmingly, we don't need yet another definition. There's so many out there. But there seemed to be a clear ask for NIST to work on a taxonomy. Not so much because there's a lack of taxonomies, but at least NIST could provide a common harmonized taxonomy so that people are not talking across each other, because they feel that's happening quite a bit. A lot of this you probably don't need me to kind of talk about. This is just kind of like the status quo and what we're seeing. There's a patchwork kind of requirements that are evolving both globally as well as in the US. I was talking to some folks over the coffee break. A patchwork of regulations and a patchwork of requirements, either domestic, national, or globally, doesn't really benefit anybody, either a manufacturer or a consumer. We find as well, you know, when a manufacturer or a vendor can actually build to a larger market, it actually allows them to actually implement innovation into more of their products more cost effectively, rather than having to selectively choose which version of my product is actually going to reap the benefits of this new innovation. So looking at our kind of charter and our mission, these are some of the things we're actually trying to help avoid. There is this general sense that there is kind of a lack of security and that there's been a market failure. That's not for me to pontificate on, but there seems to be a general sense, hey, the market really needs something more here. And cybersecurity, and I think even in the traditional IT world, I know we say we have a lot of good lessons learned. Security is an afterthought, even in traditional IT exists, so it shouldn't be kind of a surprise that that also exists in IoT. So this is just kind of some of highlighting, you know, some of the work that we know is happening around the globe, and as we kind of try to reach out. I don't think there can ever be a perfect harmonization, but just a couple of weeks ago, I was with the US delegation at an OECD event in Brussels, and a lot of the regulators for consumer products were sitting around the table and we're talking, and they were actually talking about, hey, IoT is actually one of the areas that we could actually get out ahead and start talking about how we can harmonize rather than being in this position where we see a lot of regulations across the globe and in certain areas that have percolated up over the years, only to find that they're actually at conflict, and then you have the regulators trying to work backwards and figure out how to resolve these. So I think we're actually at a really good time to start these discussions around policy internationally. So having understood, here's the status quo and all the things, this actually was on the heels of Mirai. There was a report that went to the president. It was authored by both Department of Commerce as well as DHS. It was around enhancing the resilience of the internet against botnets and automated distributed threats. This went to the president, I think it was in late June. It was accepted and embraced by the current administration. It calls for a number of actions across the nation in support of this work. A good number of those are focused on IoT. And one of my colleagues could probably talk to you about all the other ones. I'm very selfish, and I only focus on the ones related to IoT. But there are a lot of actions in there around, botnet takedowns and things that the infrastructure providers can do to help support some of these actions. But I focus primarily on the IoT ones, which I will talk about coming up shortly. What I'm going to be covering is the roadmap. So a lot of feedback once the strategy went out. The current administration said, yes, this is great, let's do it. It's a national strategy for the country. Industry came back and said, great. We've seen these strategies before. You write them, they go on a shelf. Everybody says, this is great, this is what we need to do, and then nothing happens. So we committed to taking a lot of the actions out. We pulled out every single action that was called for in the report, and we put it into a roadmap, which was a challenge for those that don't really come from a project management background. We put time frames, we put dates, we put owners, we put dependencies, and we published a roadmap last week. These are all the IoT actions that were called out. There are actions here around defining a core security baseline. The idea behind a core security baseline, again, is kind of to avoid that patchwork. We think there's not going to be one size that fits all. Every vertical may, obviously, if you operate in critical infrastructure, your baseline may look different than a baseline potentially in consumer products. Not that one is lower than the other, but the expectations about what your users are capable of are different. But we do think that a core baseline should be able to be identified. And there's multiple reasons I can talk to you about why we think that needs to be done. NIST is actually taking the lead on that action, so we are going to be working across private industry and across academia. We're going to be working with regulators. We've already started engaging with some of them back in the US to start talking about, okay, what should go into this core baseline? Let's harmonize as much as possible. If you're building an IoT device and you're not really sure yet what your market is, if we can at least have a harmonized core baseline, that will hopefully get you 90% of where you need to be, depending on what vertical you actually want to sell in. And we also think there's this concept of displaced value proposition that's important. As long as my DVR is still working, I'm not going to actually be interested in paying for a device that can support some kind of super security that I don't really understand, because my DVR is still working. The fact that that DVR may have been used in a botnet and actually ended up in causing catastrophic economic cost to some online presence or online real estate doesn't necessarily affect me. So we do think this concept of a core baseline is needed. These are the items that the federal government is also going to lead on. We got told we need the federal government to lead by example. NIST, you need to define what the requirements are for the federal government to procure IoT devices. GSA probably needs to write some procurement language for that. So here's kind of a lot of some of the actions that the federal government's going to take. These are the 15 initial baseline. And the reason I included these is going to talk a little bit about security versus privacy and why we decided for the time being to defer the privacy baseline and discuss only the security baseline. And we came up with these 4 criteria that we are going to use to talk about what the baseline needs to look like for IoT devices, at least the core baseline. These are up for discussion. We're going to be publishing a white paper. There's a draft sitting in my inbox that needs to be reviewed. But we are going to be publishing a baseline, and then we are headed to, this is kind of what our top 7 candidates look like that we think, based on the criteria that we came up with, these are the 7 that we think are most realistically the potential baseline. These are some questions we have to consider. We're going to be posing them in the white paper that we're publishing. And then I hit the road again, and I'm really racking up the frequent flyer miles because I do travel a lot. We're headed out to CES. I'm talking to the Chamber of Commerce. I engage a lot. Where there's a couple of academic conferences I'm headed to. We're going to be inviting stakeholder feedback on the white paper that we put out there, host a couple of workshops, and hopefully we'll have a draft out sometime mid-year, hopefully working towards this core baseline, which I'm signed up for, and I think publicly I have a stated date that's mid-year 2019. This is how you can contact me, and you can find all this information out on the public website, and NIST is very open and transparent. We publish pretty much everything we work on because it's taxpayer dollars. Right, sorry about that. Thank you.